Back in their university days, Nicholas wooed Alice with an effortless charm that left her friends quietly envious. At first, she brushed him off, finding him a bit odd, quirky even. But as they got to know each other better, Nick's real character began to shine through, and she gradually came to see just how much she'd overlooked. Beneath the surface was a genuinely kind and remarkable man, and Alice soon realized she'd misjudged someone who might just be exactly what she'd been searching for. Thankfully, that rocky first impression faded into memory, and by the time they tossed their graduation caps, they were a couple in every sense of the word. 3 years down the line, Nicholas didn't think twice before asking her to marry him, and Alice, glowing with joy, said yes without hesitation. They agreed to take their time before starting a family, choosing instead to focus on each other and enjoy life as a twosome for a while. Their decision, however, didn't sit well with their parents, who rarely missed the chance to nudge or outright nag them about grandchildren. Nick and Alice couldn't help but laugh at their parents' persistent prodding. It was easier to find humor in it than to explain themselves again and again. Alice soon landed a job through a family connection, one that let her apply her professional skills at a local factory. The work turned out to be far more fulfilling than she'd expected. What she loved most was the constant change. No 2 days felt the same. Even when she came home exhausted, there was a deep satisfaction that came from learning something new. And she loved telling Nick all about it, often spending half the evening reliving her day over dinner. One night, between bites, she casually mentioned a 3-week business trip that had come up. She'd be staying with an old school friend during that time. "Sorry to leave you flying solo for so long," she said with an apologetic smile. "I promise I'll have your back with your studies when I'm back. Okay?" Nick nodded, a blend of pride and loneliness twisting inside him. He was thrilled for Alice. That was the kind of opportunity she'd worked hard for. But the idea of coming home to an empty apartment for 3 weeks didn't exactly fill him with joy. Still, he knew she couldn't say no to this. When he asked when she was leaving, she told him her flight was scheduled for the end of the week. Once Alice landed in the capital, her old friend Jane and Jane's partner Nate were there to welcome her. Jane practically burst with excitement. It had been ages since they'd last seen each other, and there was plenty of catching up to do. The days flew by. The job was intense, packed with meetings and new responsibilities, leaving Alice barely enough energy for anything else. Most evenings she dragged herself through the front door, crashed into bed, and barely remembered falling asleep before the alarm blared again. Jane did her best to shuffle her own schedule to make time for Alice, but things didn't always line up. Still, one day stood out, a night Alice would later wish she could erase forever. "Got the day off today?" Nate asked casually over breakfast. Alice gave a small nod. "Jane, what do you say we go out tonight? Grab some drinks, kick back with a movie?" Nate suggested. "Yeah, sure. Why not?" Jane replied, and Alice smiled in agreement. Later that evening, the three of them stocked up on snacks and beer, then lounged around the living room. Picking a movie turned into a whole ordeal, and somewhere in the back and forth, Alice began to feel oddly restless. When they finally settled on something, she tried to focus, but her eyes grew heavy. Before she knew it, she had drifted off. Waking up in the dead of night, Alice blinked, dazed and confused. It took a few seconds to remember where she was, but once she did, a chill ran down her spine. She was on the couch, Nate's arms wrapped tightly around her. Panicked, she tried to wriggle free, but he only pulled her closer, murmuring in her ear, "Shoo." The alcohol still lingering in her system made it hard to think clearly. Everything felt fuzzy, unreal, but that whisper, low and breathy, jolted her back to awareness. Her whole body tensed. Instinctively, she froze as Nate began to stroke her, his touch unwelcome and disturbing. The next morning, nothing was said. Not a word. They both went about their day as if the night before had never happened. Alice chose to stay silent, convincing herself it had been a one-off mistake. They'd both been drinking, after all. No lines were technically crossed, at least not in a way she could explain. Telling Nicholas felt pointless, and if she was honest, terrifying. When she returned home, Nicholas greeted her with the kind of warmth that made her heart ache. Arms full of flowers, bright helium balloons bobbing behind him. His eyes lit up the second he saw her, and he wrapped her in a long, tight hug. "I missed you so much," he whispered into her hair. And just like that, guilt swept over her like a wave, thick and suffocating. A few days later, Nicholas's phone rang. A woman's voice, soft but unfamiliar, greeted him on the other end. "Nick? Hey. You probably don't remember me." Caught off guard, he responded cautiously. Hi." It was Jane. She began asking strange questions, vague, uncomfortable things that didn't seem to have any clear point. Nicholas, puzzled, gave polite answers, trying to keep up. And then, without warning, she dropped it. She and Nate had broken up. He blinked, unsure what to say. "I'm sorry to hear that," he offered carefully. "But why are you telling me this?" There was a pause, a deep sigh, almost like she was working up the nerve. "Because it wasn't just one thing," she said slowly. "It's what he did while I was gone. Girls from the club. He brought them back to the apartment while I was at work." Nick leaned back, confusion starting to twist into unease. "Okay, but what does this have to do with me?" His stomach turned. "What are you trying to say?" Another long silence. Then, "I think there's something you should know. Something she won't tell you herself." Nicholas didn't wait to hear more. He thanked her stiffly and ended the call. Sitting there, phone still in hand, he stared into space. Everything Jane had said echoed in his head like a bad dream he couldn't shake off. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the knot in his chest was impossible to ignore. That night, he came home carrying a bottle of wine. He opened it over dinner, pouring a glass for Alice. She looked up, a little surprised, then accepted it with a soft smile. Neither of them said what was really on their minds. Unexpectedly, in the midst of their meal, Nicholas decided to test the waters. He shared a story about a friend who had been cheated on by his wife, hoping to gauge Alice's reaction. He kept his tone light, almost casual as he recounted the tale. But Alice, her face a perfect mask of composure, listened intently and nodded along, seemingly unaffected by the topic. Just as Nick was wrapping up the fictional account, Alice's phone buzzed with a new message. Her expression shifted immediately, her face draining of color as she read the text. It was from Jane. "I told your husband everything," along with a few choice words. The words hit Alice like a punch to the gut. Slowly, she looked up, her gaze meeting Nicholas's. His eyes were filled with a quiet understanding, and it dawned on her exactly why he'd chosen to bring up such a sensitive topic. She could no longer hide from the truth. "What did they send you?" Nicholas asked, his voice careful but firm. Alice's eyes welled up with tears, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I'm sorry." A wave of panic washed over her, the overwhelming urge to flee the table, to escape this confrontation, nearly taking control. But Nick, surprisingly calm, reached out and stopped her with a simple gesture, waiting patiently for her to regain some composure. "Is there something you need to confess?" he asked softly, his eyes never leaving hers. Alice nodded weakly, unable to form a full sentence. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating even, as Nicholas's mind swirled with unspoken questions. His thoughts were fragmented, each one cutting into the next, but none could form into the words he needed to say. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nicholas broke the silence. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady yet filled with an underlying pain. Alice's tears flowed freely now. But Nick, though instinctively wanting to comfort her, restrained himself. He stood, the weight of the moment pressing on him. The apartment, a gift from Alice's parents when she'd entered adulthood, was hers alone. Nicholas, now without a home, gathered his things and left, temporarily staying with a friend. Their divorce followed soon after, a formal end to what had once seemed a hopeful future. In the months that followed, Alice didn't remarry. She entered a few short relationships, but none lasted, each one fizzling out before anything substantial could form. Her friends, once close, turned their backs on her when they learned about the affair. They couldn't bear to associate with someone they feared might betray them in the same way. In their eyes, Alice had become unforgivable, irredeemable. Alone, Alice found fleeting solace in her work during the day, throwing herself into her career to escape the emptiness. But by night, she succumbed to alcohol, her only companion in the quiet. Each drink was a desperate attempt to drown the resentment that had taken root in her heart.